Welcome to the Campaign Trend Podcast, where you're joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. My guest today is Adrianne Marsh, CEO of Altum Insight, a qualitative research firm that digs into the why behind how voters think and behave. Adrianne is a veteran Democratic operative who's worked at the highest levels of the party, campaigns for Barack Obama and Senator Claire McCaskill. Her team's recent study of rural Nebraska voters sheds light on what voters really think about artificial intelligence. Today, we'll dig into that report, how much voters really understand AI, and what it may mean for campaigns in 2026. Adrianne, your team at Altum Insight just wrapped up this qualitative study of rural voters in Nebraska. And you came away with what you described as striking fears about AI in the minds of voters. Walk us through that. What were you hearing from these voters, and what stood out to you the most?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Eric. The desire to do a study in Nebraska is somewhat born out of this idea that that there's a segment of voters that we're having in the Democratic Party a very challenging time, not just connecting with, but our rate of loss in this community is staggering in that we can't quite figure out how to get a new footing. So the idea was that we wanted to take a state where there isn't necessarily a harsh vacuum where just one message is getting through because there just isn't any competitive race of any kind. And it's not that it's getting a disproportionate amount of competitive messaging from either side. It more has like a natural landscape of what people might be getting, a mix of both messages. Um, and the idea was that we were just going to go in and talk to them. So sometimes with the studies that we do in deep qualitative research, we sometimes focus on an issue, which would be like more of a taxonomy type focus. And then in other cases, it's more of a psychographic view of just, hey, what are you up to? What are you thinking about? What's top of mind these days? That was more what we were focusing on with this particular study. So this was happening kind of on the heels of the off-year elections in November of last year. This was at a time when Democrats saw fairly decent success in some of the statewide elections for governor. Some of the municipal races did better than even anticipated. And the message of the day we were told was, it's all about the economy, stupid. Like that this is the thing we're going to ride home on all year round. It's economic affordability concerns. We figured that's what would show up here. We thought we'd hear a little bit about economic trade issues, particularly relating to the agricultural industry. We thought we might hear a little bit about rural healthcare, certainly a lot about affordability. Our head researcher likes to joke that we fell ass backwards into something that was profound, which was steep concerns that far outpace the economic concerns I just discussed around fears of AI. And you would even make the assumption, based on what I just talked about, but also just based on general assumption, that these voters would have a concern about the economic impact of AI. Is it coming for their jobs? Will it have an impact on just the economy around them in general? Is our data centers a threat to them locally? Which did come up. It just wasn't a profound finding. The biggest issue was really about a way of life. This was about something where they felt like AI could undermine their values. It's about a trust issue. It's about what they can believe and what they can't believe, and more so that there's not really a champion out there doing anything about it. And this is where, as Democrats, we kind of see that there may be an opportunity for us as Democrats to get a footing in a place where this particular segment of voters have not been interested in speaking with us about healthcare or the economy. They haven't really aligned with us in a way where they trust what we have to say about anything. But this is a situation where we feel like we actually do have a different inroad, and this could be an opportunity we don't want to squander. So it was an interesting finding. All of my research team would tell me, as I'm sure your research team with your organization would tell you, it bears additional research. But it was such a profound and obviously it's backed up in other research publicly. It was so profound that we really feel like this is a big thing that everyone should be paying attention to.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is and surprising is the specificity of what you found. So like these weren't vague anxieties about robots. They were concerns about, as you say, the cultural influence, threats to children, accountability. And so I'm curious, how do you distinguish between fears that are rooted in something real that voters are experiencing versus fears that are shaped by kind of the media environment and political rhetoric and what we're seeing in movies?
I'm sure there's a lot of that. I'm sure people are making these drawing these conclusions because of a lot of what they see and hear online. But so much of this, and I'm sure so many people you talk to as well, in small communities and small towns, this is reinforced by value-based conversations that are happening at coffee hour after church or the coffee shop at the corner or when you run into each other at the grocery store. These are things where they'll say, hey, I caught, my child was doing homework the other day and wrote a paper that didn't sound anything like them. I'm worried about the future of what their educational path or what their attitudes toward work and effort look like if they have this easy option that's so not detectable. And what do we do about that? These are real pragmatic fears that people are exchanging in real time with one another in the place they live with the people they trust. And I think that's what's answering your question. But I think so much of this is reinforced by the intimate nature of these communities and what they believe is a very special place. It's a way of life and a community that they want to do whatever it takes to protect. The very idea that there's nobody regulating this and there's so many different ways that AI can infiltrate their lives and undermine their values, there's a fear that there's not an advocate for that unless it's them. What they do about it is, I think, the challenge.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there is an interesting thing here. I mean, as a technology evangelist and a big believer in the transformative power of AI, I do acknowledge that we are in this very awkward transition phase between pre-AI and post-AI, and so there are, we don't know where we're going, right? And so if I can play not skeptic, but I don't know. How am I trying to put this into place as a campaign manager in
Sure.
2026? So, if we're looking at our polling, the quantitative data, and it tells me these are the top 5 issues that people bring up, and this is a separate conversation about why we should ask more open ends than just give the punch options. But how do you make the case that AI belongs in ads, in mailers, in the conversation against all of the economy, cost of living, wars, that kind of stuff?
I mean, the a little bit of the irony of how this research came to be is that much of the research we do is AI enabled, AI enhanced, AI. There's all kinds of features in the way that we process our research that depends on AI. I think there is a balance. So I'll get into the nitty gritty of how this research works along the lens of AI that you're talking about, how it has a place in how we maximize outcomes. Certainly there's a place for that. I think the issue here is that the way that the AI piece worked with this particular study is that there's not a way where you can choose how it enters your life and how you use it. Whereas the kind of environment you're talking about, there's a selection process of where the boundaries live and where you intend to add human thinking and where it doesn't. I think you make a good point about open-ended questions. A big part of how this research came to be is that we found that we were having such a tough time in rural communities figuring out how to connect with these voters. And what we realized is that in the process of doing even the edges of what might be considered qualitative research in politics right now doesn't go as far as it should for the very things you're talking about. Focus groups are moderated by a consultant or by
Mhm.
a moderator who has a particular intent in mind about what you're going to ask people and what you're looking for out of those focus groups. Polls are people sitting around a room deciding what goes into an instrument that largely hasn't changed in the last 10, 20, even 30 years. And it's basically a battery of things that are limited. Well, what if the 20th thing on a 10 issue battery is the thing that pops off the charts that we thought, no, there's just no way. But that's the thing. We just have to find a different way to back end sentiment from voters by these open ended ideas. And that's what this research does. We have two different ways that we do this. One of them is a qualit scale tool that uses an AI bot And it is so conversational and so human-like that when it talks to hundreds, if not thousands of people at one time, you can have an apples to apples analysis of 6 questions that go into this tool. Everyone will answer those 6 questions, but every single person will have a unique, bespoke conversation with the bot that sounds so human-like. It will be very conversational and it will evolve very naturally. There is also something we didn't expect out of that tool, which was people often know it's such a perfect conversation that it can't be a human. So they will also understand that there's an anonymity about it. There's a confessional quality that they know a human isn't judging them on the other end. So they'll often share things that they might not share with their spouses. And they're disclosing to this tool. That is an incredible amount of very useful and valuable qualitative insight
And
from
you're not paying by the minute to
entirely.
the interviewer.
Exactly. It's entirely qualitative and it's also apples to apples because each one of those questions gets measured and analyzed. The larger frame of what we do is this deep qualitative research where a representative sample of that larger group will be selected to be part of a panel. And then over 4 days, we'll use a moderator. So it's a human trained ethnographer, a professional ethnographer that will end up moderating these individual iterative interviews with each one of these people over 4 days, where it will begin with very large values, generalized conversations, and it will evolve naturally, which they will think is an organic evolution to the idea that they're talking about politics, that they led us there without realizing that the ethnographer is trained to ultimately lead you there. Sometimes I describe it like, you can see my Detroit Lions are in the back, but I'm a huge Lions fan, and I sort of describe it for people who don't quite understand what I'm talking about. That if you were to come to me and say, I want to convince you to be, I don't know what your NFL team is, but if you want to convince me to be a Chiefs fan, let's just say, I'll say, no way, I'm not going to do that. I will literally put on my jersey and I will tell you that Dan Campbell is the greatest coach of all time. That's the conversation because you will have come to me talking to me about something. I will be hardened and I will be conviction based about my beliefs. But if you start that conversation by asking me where I'm from, how I might have spent my time in my childhood, what I do on Sundays, by the time you know I'm a Lions fan, the kind of things you have learned from that conversation mean that when you make a connection with me about try to convincing, persuading me to do something, you will have learned all the reasons and you can connect with me on those points individually. That's the kind of way we should be having conversations with voters, and we often don't. We end up coming to them with these polls where it's political, and they will immediately engage with you from a political mind frame. We're learning nothing about how to communicate with them or how to persuade them. This work is narrative based because the idea is that we're learning about the story people are telling themselves, where we as Democrats or where you as Republicans live in that story, so we can understand in reality where that is and how we can shape it. How do we earn votes, or how do we earn trust, which ideally translates into voter behavioral change, which is obviously
So,
voting.
Adrian, do you get the sense that this conversations about AI and policy around AI and how voters think about AI should be on the table for candidates in 2026 alongside affordability in the economy? Is that where it needs to be? I mean, or is it more of a, hey, we're gathering information about what voters feel about?
So this question probably gets a little bit off from where the research is. This is a little bit more Adrianne Marsh, 25-year Democratic operative gut level. Where do I believe we should, how do we, I believe we should thread that needle? Absolutely. This should be a much bigger topic from candidates talking to voters than it is right now. It should be front and center. It's top of mind for nearly every group out there. Um, but at the same time, we also risk eroding trust if we act like, hey, this is a huge problem and we should do something about it. But you're also creating your ads using AI. You can't be half pregnant on this. You have to be able to say, listen, this is here. It's here to stay. There's a lot we can get out of it, but this is about working together to find out where we need regulation and where we need to build some guardrails around this stuff because it's what you want ultimately. This is what voters want. They want to be able to trust this. They also understand that it's making a lot of the world a better place. I mean, there are ads everywhere talking about how it's helping local manufacturers, which I'm sure you've seen that around here. It is compelling how efficient it can be. It can reduce costs for consumers. It can make things more efficient. It can make things safer. It's just a matter of understanding that I think they would rather there be some level of transparency regulated into it. And the interesting thing about this data was that this particular research study, it used a three generational cohort group, which was Gen Z, millennial, and Gen X. And I would have guessed, if I had to, which generation would be most embracing of AI would have been the younger generation. And that I was completely wrong. The Gen Z cohort was skeptical, uh, reluctant, even angry about the use of AI. They didn't trust it at all and just thought, there's not a chance I want it as part of my life. Where do I turn it off?
Okay.
Then there was the millennial, which was a little bit on a mixed group, but more toward the Gen Z. The Gen Xers were far more. I mean, certainly the skepticism and even some of the anger about the lack of transparency lived in everyone. But I think the Gen Xers, and we've heard this about boomer studies similarly, that there's this idea, hey, I wasn't born into tech the way that these younger generations
Mhm.
were. I may be at a disadvantage when it comes to crafting the perfect email or knowing how to use everything out there. And if I can ask this bot that's not going to judge me how to do something I don't know how to do, I don't have to feel silly by calling my son or my
Right.
grandkids to ask me what does this even mean. If I hear a word that the Gen Zers or Gen Alphas using on the playground, I can be like, what does that mean? And then I don't have to look silly. It certainly is useful because to some degree we need that. We weren't born, we weren't emergent into this thing the way that younger people are. But it's a real challenge because if we want to have credibility with these younger generations, we have to address that serious significant concern.
You're listening to the Campaign Trend Podcast. I'm speaking with Adrianne Marsh from Altum Insight about the role AI could play as a political issue in 2026. So here's where I want to bring this into the campaign world. There's this, speaking of regulation, there's this wave of state level regulation and legislation aimed at regulating how campaigns can use AI. So, they've got deepfake disclosures, synthetic media bans. The AAPC, American Association of Political Consultants, is doing really good work on tracking all of this. And so from what you're seeing in your research and the campaigns that you work with, is that legislation something that's responding to something real? Or are lawmakers just kind of panicking over a problem that hasn't materialized yet?
I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about how the legislation came to be, what it might have been motivated and modeled from. But the place where I could see it probably being the most useful, which seems like there are likely, and I haven't studied this policy in depth, but the kind of coverage that you get in how you attack opponents. I think that the deepfake situation would obviously be something that would need to be concerned. I believe that's already covered through image language around disparaging your opponent. Now, that's much looser on the independent expenditure side, where the repercussions of disparaging opponents is far less uh, something that you can prosecute. Um, I would imagine that that is something that we would need to be careful about because it's still a little bit of the Wild West in that space. Uh, but I don't know. I haven't heard of any problematic examples where AI has been a negative in campaigns. I think if anything, I think consultants might be worried about it because there are probably some jobs on the chopping block of certainly the creative side, but also probably the analytics side, probably even some of the instruments that we're using in our own research. These are things that could be easily manufactured through a bot. I even heard to some degree that someone was trying to replicate a consultant's advice with a bot feature for sale, which is just mind blowing to me that we would try to eradicate that kind of necessity of a human voice.
Mhm.
There's really nothing that replicates that experience piece of it. But I'm sure we'll try everything, and I'm sure it will be policy will be shaped out of necessity,
Yeah.
ideally. I haven't heard of anything that has
Yeah,
been
I mean,
enormously
so
problematic. I'm
I
sure
mean,
deep fakes have been a concern.
yeah, and I think probably the biggest frustration from someone like me of trying to help practitioners on this is it's a patchwork of all the different states. One state has these rules and another state has these rules, and I'm I would. It's something that we're keeping an eye on, but moving into, I might ask you to really put on your Democratic hat here, because there's a story out this week about the disparity between Republicans using AI on their campaigns and Democrats using AI on their campaigns, and even in some industry surveys I've seen that there's kind of a lag on the left in terms of adopting AI. What's your read on that divide and what's going on? What's driving it?
I don't know that I have a good pulse on why that is to be, other than that's probably just the appetite of of the culture on the
Mhm.
left, is that there may just be some additional concerns. I think that more and more as operatives, we're finding that there's significant value in that human touch, that human relationship. We're leaning more and more into real, truly grassroots power, and how you can harness a lot of that for fantastic results. We've tried to replicate that. We've tried to overcompensate with heavy, heavy data, with just completely,
Right.
pipelining things through tech. And I think we found that there has always been a downside. And so we have found some of the best areas of success that we've had are in door to door, person to person organizing. And my guess is that that's just a difference in where the strengths of our bases happen to be. So that would be my assumption, is that I wouldn't say that it's lagging as much as it's potentially a strategic choice. Now, I think that there may not be significant big, let's call big AI movements to replace the things that we do with AI, but it does seem to be an important component at the edges to make a lot of those systems that I was just talking about operate much more efficiently. Like, we may not be doing ad testing entirely with AI, but there are significant parts of that ad testing process that are made more efficient through AI. So I don't know to what degree that is being categorized
Yeah.
as like an AI function, if that would be matching up apples to apples. But I'm seeing AI almost entirely touching every single part of the campaign world as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, one my hypothesis on this was maybe there was some sort of organized labor component of, look, we don't want to take jobs away from humans, and so we're keeping the AI at arm's length, or security, or things like that. And yeah, it's interesting to me how sort of adoption is not evenly distributed, and you touched on something earlier that I want to come back to, which is, we are using this AI in internal efficiency, we should say, so writing faster, analyzing data,
Hmm.
automating workflows, whatever that means. And where do you see the value add ways that campaigns can use AI in that voter facing way? And you alluded to, hey, we maybe don't want to be using AI in our ads, probably don't want to be creating an AI avatar of our candidate who can't be bothered to be on camera, those sorts of things. Do you think we can use AI to deepen that engagement rather than just make the trains run faster?
Again, this is where my opinion is probably different from maybe what everyone else's opinion might be. And as far as organized labor goes, I mean, obviously, I value our friends in labor to the nth degree. I don't know that has. I think there are policies in that space that are significant and important. That does not seem to have a crossover here, and there hasn't really ever been a movement within the Democratic Party to have the same kind of organizing that we value in other spaces for any reason. So I don't know that those jobs are protected, or I don't know that there's a real concern that they wouldn't. My sense is we evolve into the spaces that industries need us to evolve into, and this will be reflective of the same kind of trend. Now, with that same thing in mind, I do see places where, as a former, I used to work for a specific, two different specific television firms where that was the focus, is digital TV advertising. both in creating and in placing. And I would say there were so many times where I felt like, certainly, if you wanted to do a candidate to camera, real connective ad, there's no replacing how you make that happen. Not all candidates are fit for that, though. Let's be
Yeah.
honest. Even some of the best of them, you're like, all right, maybe we just feature
Do
you
a
walking
VO.
here.
Yeah.
We're walking, we're doing a voiceover. It's all great. But voiceovers are incredibly important. Now, that's going to cost somebody their job. um, if we're doing, let's just say, a straight contrast ad where it's all proof points and graphics, it seems to me that if the AI capabilities are there, why would we not find cost efficiencies in those places if the objective is about using money to maximize connections and contact with voters? I don't know why we would do that differently. I would think that if we're trying to put as much money behind these things as we possibly can, that's what we should do. Now, that's probably not something everybody would celebrate, and I understand why. But we also have to evolve behind the objective, and that is the objective.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there are more people working in the political industry today than 20 years ago. But there are also jobs that were around 20 years ago that don't exist anymore. I mean, just thinking my own experience, one of the first things I had to do, most people don't realize why they're called clips, is because I worked in the district office
Literally,
and I had to get up and clip the newspaper, fax it
literally.
up to Washington, D.C. And so I don't know that the humanity, and I certainly hope that the humanity doesn't go out of campaigning in the campaign industry, but those jobs are going to be looking a lot different. I think one example I was having came up with a conversation the other day is crosstabs. Crosstabs were originally created for binders. And I don't know the last time that I've seen a poll in an actual binder with crosstabs. It's probably been 10 years. I'm not going to name any names, but there are some operatives out there who still really like their binders. And maybe we find new ways of doing that. But I suspect you're right that it's going to evolve. People, again, it's that sort of near term discomfort and friction, but we'll see it through to the other side.
I think that's an astute observation, is that there are places like, if you can feed 6,000 pages of crosstabs into AI and ask for the anomalies, or ask for a particular segment of voters, and any analysis that's profound, it feels like that's a perfect way to find some efficiencies. So you're not having someone spend 3 days combing through data
With the
with the
ruler
risk of
and
missing
yeah,
something. I mean,
yeah.
granted, there's a risk of missing something anyway. I mean, there are a bunch of anecdotes, but where you ask Chat GPT how many bees are in blueberry, and it says three because there's blueberry and blueberry. It's going to have accidents like that. But the human error in something like 6,000 pages of crosstabs is far more significant than probably running it through an AI feature that would be able to give you some analysis. It's really the human connection part that we should be resistant to AI, because there's so much about, you know, helping candidates find their voice. There's so much about using anecdotal experience from a campaign 20 years ago that you haven't needed until this moment. And then this moment is the moment where it can bring those things together, and you might be able to find a path forward. It's all of those unique experiences that we also need to make sure that there's space for. We can't entirely replace the human element. But that's the issue, is that this is a constantly evolving thing. I mean, I I can't imagine how significant it was when email hit campaigns, or when you were just talking about faxing clips. Now you can search for clips and you can cut and paste the links into an email. Clipping takes no time and everybody can get it, as opposed to the arduous process that probably took you hours upon hours, and the process to get it to where it was going was kind of ridiculous. All of those efficiencies are just part of of the bell curve of technology that we're dealing with right now. That's a beautiful thing. Why wouldn't we be maximizing that in every practical way we possibly can?
Yeah. Another funny sort of job that has gone away. My wife worked on the 2008 John McCain campaign, and she knew when the last pickup from FedEx was, because she had to mail DVDs of the latest TV ad out to wherever they were going to be in the field and that kind of stuff, because
Oh yeah.
we didn't have fast enough internet to download spots. Adrianne, I want to look ahead. You've got this research. We've got the 2020 cycle, 2026 cycle, and we kind of know where that's trending. what should practitioners be looking at when it comes to AI and voter attitudes? So, what's the thing that's going to catch campaigns off guard if they're not paying attention to, again, those voter attitudes? I know the data centers get a lot of attention, but it seems like there's some other things boiling just below the surface that you've started to touch on.
Yeah, I mean, this cycle, this particular election year feels, for any number of reasons, which I'm sure you can understand, a little upside down. And it turns out voters are feeling that way too. I sometimes joke, but it's the reality of, on my side, my big concerns are that if we do well in this election cycle, which I suspect at this point we probably will, it will not be as much because we've earned it. It's because maybe the other side gave themselves some self-imposed wounds, or the choice just didn't turn out, I think, the way that everyone would have thought it would for this year. That is not because we've done a strategic good job, to be clear. And there is a real piece of evidence that's popped out through AI that, frankly, if we were to ask maybe healthcare differently or the economy differently, would probably pop out just the same. And that is the values conversation. This is about people not wanting their lives to be enormously upended. They don't want to feel like they're watching some people run away with the show while they're getting the short end of the stick. I think people are feeling like, and I'll give you one last anecdote, which doesn't have anything to do with AI, so I apologize, but we did a study 2 years ago in Montana of independent voters around the taxonomy of democracy and what their perceptions of democracy were at the time. Donald Trump was talking about democracy in one way, and Joe Biden was talking about it in another way, more through the lens of, we're going to protect democracy. Democracy is on the ballot. Well, when we got into the paradigms of the different views of what democracy was, the interesting thing was that people were when we say democracy is on the ballot, to them, democracy is a structural institution. So it's like saying the ballot is on the ballot. We were
Right.
missing, we weren't speaking with people. We were talking at them because we didn't take time to understand them. And so when we got into the throes of what democracy meant to them, we also learned that they don't exactly think that government's working for them. And that's under anybody's leadership. This institution isn't protecting them. It's not advocating. They don't even find it useful. So the idea that there's a 22% trust rate in Congress, or that largely people are just not turning out to vote anymore because they don't feel like anybody speaks to them. Our takeaway from that particular piece of research was that um, the idea was that they were looking for some kind of disruption. And both under Joe Biden and Harris, the idea was that we were going to protect democracy. We were going to protect this thing that they think is broken. Well, they didn't want us to protect it.
Right.
And so they thought, well, if this guy's going to burn it all down and these people are going to keep it fully intact, well, let's burn it all down. Let's see what happens. I don't know that they bargained for what they're getting, to be honest. I mean, I know that's from me on the other side, but this might be a little much for everybody. I think if we had offered some fixed democracy, we hear you, we see you, it's not working. Let's hold hands and get through this together, but let's break it up a little bit. That was probably the dose of disruption that they were looking for. We just didn't bother to listen. We didn't bother to understand that everybody kind of feels left behind. It's, I think, to your point, that we need to have more open-ended, but we need to have more conversations back and forth. We need to understand that we're all a little off here. And my guess is AI will be the accelerator to that same sentiment. If we don't understand where people, their comfort level is, where they see their tolerance for utility of AI, and where they think it oversteps, we're going to lose people, and there will be massive consequences because we are the ones still holding the rope on this. It's critical for both parties to take this very seriously.
Well, my thanks to Adrianne Marsh for a great conversation. You can learn more about her and her work in our show notes. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all that we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. You look smart in the process. More people learn about the show. It's a win-win all around. And remember to subscribe to the Campaign Trend podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And you can visit our website at campaigntrend.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Eric.
All right.